A few days ago, as I record this, a very distinguished professor, P.L.O. Lumumba, a noted Pan-Africanist in Kenya, gave a speech in which he stated that he was convinced that within 25 years Africa would be recolonized. Now, who would do such a thing? How would the world allow such a thing? The answer to that, I think, is simple. It is the United Nations. And this story, out of my own life, gives some insight into what the United Nations is really up to. It is about a man who was tasked to be a sort of midwife over the birth of a new nation. And did his best to follow Pharaoh's orders to drown the baby nation in the Nile. At this he did not succeed. Having not succeeded, I go outside the story. I've been told that in the years that followed, he tried again to kill the young nation by, under United Nations auspices, becoming the head of a mercenary military group in the jungles of the Democratic Republic of Congo, spreading disorder where he was supposed spreading order, and becoming the supply and base of operations for those forces trying to destabilize the new nation. I don't know if that's true or not, but I'm sure it is. But this is about when I met him and how his plans were foiled. The man's name is David Gressley. He had come to southern Sudan after what appears to have been a series of unsuccessful United Nations assignments, and Sudan was his last chance to show himself capable. Well-connected fellow. All of this takes place in the town of Rumbek in South Sudan. At the time it was Sudan. It was the new autonomous region of South Sudan, or sometimes called the autonomous region of Southern Sudan. They never did seem to settle on the name. And to understand that, you need a little bit of history. There had been a civil war in the 50s where the South tried to break free. The South had never historically been part of Sudan until a British governor of Kenya said that he didn't want to be governor of it in the 1800s and gave it to Egypt. But that led, a little more than 50 years later, to a civil war, which then was settled with a peace that was never properly honored by the North, the Khartoum government, which then caused the rebellion to break out again. Again in the 60s, and then a bit of a truce, and then sometime in the 1980s it broke out in fierce ferocity again. And went on for 25 years. But in 2004, some peace talks began, and on January the 10th in 2005, a comprehensive peace agreement was signed at Lake Naivasha in Kenya, where the North agreed to make the leader, the political leader of the southern faction, Dr. John Garang, to be both first vice president of the nation of Sudan and to be the president of the autonomous southern region, and guaranteed that that 5 years from that date, that the South would have an opportunity to become a new nation. There had to be a referendum, but that was far in the future because this is that was in 2010, and this story is in 2005. Now, in order to understand what happened in this story, people in the United States will have a difficult time understanding it because we have a federal republic with our three branches of government: direct election, indirect election of the president, but it is direct in that it is independent of Congress. Much of the world follows a different pattern, a pattern developed in Britain, the parliamentary system. And there is a term in the parliamentary system, forming a government. We don't have that term. It didn't make sense to me when I first heard it, and I was in Rumbeck. I guess I had heard it spoken of England before, but never registered. Because the executive is connected directly to the legislative. And forming a government is when the legislative agrees to a particular slate of officers who will be the executive branch. Those who have seen movies like The Darkest Hour or the Crown series will be familiar with this. The Prime Minister visits the king or the queen, and the crowned head says to the head of the party that won the election, "I'm asking you to form a government." And so a new government is formed. So there was a provision in the CPA, this Comprehensive Peace Agreement, that the South would form a government. And it was said who would do it, and there was not a legislative body elected yet, so basically all of the officers of the SPLA and the SPLM, a designated list, were treated as if they were the legislative. And they had to all agree. And they were from many different tribes. Primarily they were from the Jang tribe. A lot of them were from the Nuer tribe, the second largest. The Jang are actually a majority in South Sudan. Nuer are a large plurality of the rest, probably a majority of what is not Jang. And then there are the Shilluk and the Acholi and all the something like 100 equatorial tribes, which are culturally quite different than the ones I just mentioned. There's a lot of differences. And they had to get together and form a government. And it turned out that there were, in the CPA, a lot of things that wouldn't happen until a government was formed, agreed on. And until that time, the United Nations was the caretaker. Now, the whole war had been prolonged because the North, the geographic majority of the country, with its headquarters in Khartoum, was dirt poor, except that there was oil. And so they were rich from the oil. Other than that, they'd be dirt poor. And where was the oil? Well, it was in the South. That's why they wanted to keep the South. But with the new agreement, the South would get the oil, more or less, sort of, kind of. But then they would have to ship it through the North, so the North would get shipping fees. But until they formed a government, they had a caretaker, the United Nations. And all of that money went into a bank in New York on the East River. Yeah. Do you see an incentive here? Okay, so the members of the SPLM, high leaders, left Khartoum after a couple of days, and they all flew down to the provisional capital of the South, Rumbek. It brought me and my friends that had come with me down there too. Why were we there? Why were we anything? Because we were the representatives of the Nashville, Tennessee branch of the Sudan People's Liberation Movement. That indigenous political party had branches all over the world. It still does. And there was only one political party in South Sudan, the Sudan People's Liberation Movement. There was not the plurality of parties that we have in so many other countries. I was at one of their meetings, an international meeting that was held in Clarksville, was it, Tennessee? And all these young men who were involved in the SPLM were lamenting over the previous legislative election. We only won 77% of the vote. We need to improve that. There's only one party, yeah. So, sounds simple. You just form a government. Well, it's not so simple. So we were in Rumbek, and the highest officials were staying at a place called Bros, which was a truck driver's motel for the UN truck drivers that were building roads. And the UN officials and the lower ranking SPLM, that included us, were staying at a place called Apex, a little tent city that was put up by a contractor for the United Nations in ground that was considered to be United Nations territory. I've described that in more detail in the other video entitled The Tale of the Wida. So, there we were. And there were reporters there. And three reporters that we particularly got to know were a young lady from the Washington Post named Emily Wax, and a young man from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution named Ray, and a photographer with a very long face from the Washington Post. When I say a long face, he actually had a round face, but he always looked as if he was a little boy whose favorite hound dog had just died. And Ray and Emily were an item. But we got to know them, and meals were served together in a buffet style in a pavilion at Apex, and we ate a lot of meals together. And so I came out for breakfast on a Tuesday morning, the morning after the events in The Tale of the Wida. And I came out on a Tuesday morning and came out to sit down to breakfast. There was Emily and Ray and Bob and some dude that I think I'd been introduced to once before, maybe, or I'd seen him and somebody said who it was. I don't know, you know, that kind of thing. An older gentleman. Not old, but, you know, distinguished looking. Important. Well, I liked getting to know important people. Rumbek was one of my few opportunities to do that in life, so I sat down with everybody, heaped my plate full of bacon and a little bit of a few pancakes and eggs, and having a good breakfast. They were all talking, and I started talking with them and asking a question or two, and Ray goes, "Shh, shh, shh. It's Emily's interviewing David." So that was David Gressley. the United Nations Commissioner for South Sudan, or some such title like that. He was the head honcho in all of Sudan as far as the UN was concerned. He was being interviewed by the Washington Post. Emily. Okay, so I sat and listened, learned a bunch of things. And she was asking questions and he was answering, and the issue that came up after a while was the formation of government. And he was so glib. He was so full of himself. He was like, you know, whatever. So, you know, we'd been introduced. And I said I was there representing the Nashville, Tennessee delegation. And I was there representing the Christian Chronicle out of Oklahoma. So as far as he was concerned, I was a Southern white. And Ray was a Southern white. And he thought that we were, to use a modern terminology that wasn't current then, that we were up to our eyebrows in our white privilege. Like he was. Yeah. So he was gloating. He had a plan, and it was a good plan, and he was gloating over his plan. So the question was, when are they going to form a government? He said, we don't think they'll form a government, ever get a government formed. They might, it'll take them at least 6 months. There's no way it will take less than 6 months to form a government. And probably it will take them the whole year. And the catch was that in the CPA, if they didn't form a government within 1 year, July 10th, 2006, the whole deal was off. And the UN, and basically South Sudan would become a colony of the United Nations. Remember I said this is about colonization. And so we asked, well, what would happen until then? Where does the oil money go? I had started to ask questions, and they started letting me ask questions because I was asking good questions. They were good for the interview. Where's the oil money going to go? Oh, well, it's going to go into the coffers of the United Nations. Ooh, I mean, we're talking about billions of dollars here, you know? Lots of billions of dollars. Like Henry Kissinger said, a billion here and a billion there. Pretty soon it starts adding up to real money. Yeah. All right. So why do you think it's going to take so long? Well, there's so many factions. It'll take so long for all the factions to sort out. They'll never agree. You'll never get everybody to agree, and everybody has to agree in order to form a government. Really? Yeah, they're not going to agree. At that point, I said, wait a minute. What do you mean factions? There's only one political party. And there's no division like you have other places. I mean, there is no feeling of should it be capitalism or should it be socialism or should it be communism like we had grown up with in world politics. This was a Bronze Age culture all across. Those questions were meaningless. The political questions of the West were meaningless there. Well, the only factions that we have in South Sudan are tribal. And he said, oh yeah, that's what will keep them apart, is the tribal factions. And then he said some words, and I don't remember what the words were, but he gloated that the United Nations was, he was talking about national pride, meaning not the whole nation, but each nation, like the Acholi nation and the Shilluk nation. And and he kept talking about pride, but what he was saying was, we're encouraging each tribe to say, we're the best and we need to get our share. We need to have equity of outcome. That's what he was teaching every tribe. The United Nations was sowing the seeds and fanning the flames of tribalism. Well, what's wrong with that? Well, tribalism is just racism, except it's not about skin color. About other things than skin color, but it's basically racism. My race, my tribe, is better than your race, your tribe. And it's vicious in Africa. It is lethal. So that's what they're up to. And they'll never form a government because we, the United Nations, are fanning the flames of tribalism so that they won't form a government. We will make them behave like infants so that we can say, look, you're behaving like infants in the playground. We get to be your adult bosses. And as if to top it all off, he said, oh, I've got to go now. I'm a little late. I have to meet with someone. And one way or another, it came out that he was meeting with Riek Machar, the warlord who was head of the Nuer, who had already fomented one genocide, and it turns out a few years later, with the help of David Gressley, he initiated another genocide. That's who he was going to go meet with. So I finished my breakfast, came outside, and there in a circle with my friends who had come from Nashville with me was a circle of the minor high officials of the SPLA and the SPLM. I came and sat down and someone said, you look very troubled. And I said, I am. And I related the story I just told you. And there was a man there, a very important man. His name slips my mind, which is probably for the best. He was a commander in the SPLA. And he said, this needs to go to Selfa. Now at this time, John Garang, who had just been made the president of South Sudan, was still in Khartoum because he was also first vice president of the whole nation of Sudan, and he was in conferences with Omar al-Bashir, the president of Sudan, and Osman Taha, the second vice president of the whole nation of Sudan, in Khartoum, and would be there for a few days doing national government things, and then would come to the southern capital. When John Garang had been named president of the southern region, his commander-in-chief in the army, the SPLA, Salva Kiir Mayardit, had been named as vice president of the South. And so Salva was taking care of everything in the South until John Garang arrived. So they said, this has got to go to Selfa immediately. So next thing I knew, within 10 minutes, I'm in a car going to the other side of Rumbek into a military compound. But Selfa is busy. And then Selfa is taking his noon nap. And there's a line of people who have appointments with Selfa. And when they hear the story of what's going on, they one by one they say, take my space, take my space, take my space on the schedule. This is more important. So we all go in to see Selfa, and when I say we all, one of our delegation was a woman of my own age, who's actually a little older than Selfa, but Selfa had decided to adopt her as his daughter. Go figure. So there was a lot of closeness there. So we went in and they said, Selfa, you need to hear this man. So I told the story I just told you. And Selfa said, it is taken care of. And I'm going, what? What? Wait a minute, did you not hear me? Because you just learned of it. How is it taken care of? You're telling me you had spies that knew this already? Then how come your cabinet members didn't? And so my friend, I'm not mentioning names because some of this could get people hurt. It's not to leave them out. Some people would think I'm trying to take all the credit, and no, it's just sometimes it's not appropriate to name names. There's issues of safety. There's some questions of legality involved, especially the way the United States is going at the moment. So, my friend that was there with me, come from Tennessee, explained it in a different way, and Selfa said it is taken care of. And we left. We got back to AFEX, and where all the lower level officials and Riek Machar, who was very high, where all of them had been sitting around talking politics, they were gone. And we heard that they had been suddenly summoned. Everyone of any importance had been summoned to a meeting, an important meeting. Okay. So we didn't know what had happened with this until Thursday. And on Thursday, they showed up again. They were exhausted. They had been in a meeting that had lasted 48 hours without a break. No sleep. And they had formed a government. It was not announced yet. It was a secret. My friends who had come from Nashville with me, the 6 members of the SPLM, that story is told better in the video the day I met Hamza bin Laden. We were the only persons, and 3 of us were the only white persons, the only non-African, who knew what was going on. It was a state secret that was entrusted to us, that they were forming a government. They had all signed, all of the important people that in the SPLM had signed a document that assigned who would be what minister, who would be what governor, etc. But they could not communicate this directly with John Garang because all of the communication channels were compromised. They had sent someone up north, and they were speaking in code a little bit. They'd sent someone north on an airplane to tell John, but it was a secret. So Dr. John knew what they were doing, but the details weren't worked out. There was one little hitch that came up on Thursday, and that will be told in another video, which will be titled something like the Rumbek Rebellion, which was not a rebellion. That's a very funny story. You'll have to watch that video. But they had formed a government, and it was to be announced. And on Friday, Dr. John, the president, showed up, and we all met him at the airport. And meantime, Emily and Ray and Bob had gone off to cattle camp. You can look up online, go to search for Washington Post cattle camp, and you'll see Emily Wax's article with Bob's photographs. It's a culturally interesting article. And they showed up at the end of the weekend, and they said, man, we have to get on a plane Sunday afternoon and go back to Nairobi. We're tired. And I said, change your plans. You need to stay around. And they said, what, you're talking about that meeting on Monday? Oh, they're just going to announce that they're moving to Juba. No. Couldn't tell them what it was about. I wanted them to stay. I wanted them to get I like these people. I wanted them to get the scoop. But no. But no. So, we all went there on Monday morning. The announced meeting, that there was going to be a meeting in Freedom Square. So we went to Freedom Square, and some other things happened that involved me, and I don't have to wait for another video, the stuff about me. But I will say that if you look at the Al Jazeera video of that event, for about 2 frames you'll see me in it, and I'm standing in a not full dress uniform, sort of an improvised uniform, amongst battle dress uniform members of the SPLA, because I was drafted into the SPLA. And I'm standing there. It was quite an honor to be among the honor guard for Dr. John as he got up and announced the formation of government.
Talata ka advisors, Commander Bujon, Commander Lualdi, Commander Bujon, Commander Niak, bigger advisors with the government of Southern Sudan.
What David Gressley had said would take 6 months to a year if it could be accomplished at all, we had accomplished in 5 days.
A new phase in the Sudan and a new phase for the SPLA.
5 days. And we totally thwarted the plans of the United Nations to make South Sudan a United Nations protectorate, a colony. David Gressley thought that black Africans couldn't get their act together because they were black Africans. How wrong he was.